So, for those of you who have your retinas burned from using Cataclysm, it's safe to say Limbo is my absolute favorite frame. When I first picked up the game, I saw Limbo and had to have him. He is my most played frame as of this video, and honestly, it's probably going to stay that way. With how much I've played Limbo, I've gotten the general idea of how he is meant to be used. And since I play him more, this will be a longer video than the Frost one was. Now, a few things I want to get out of the way. First, I do think he needs a bit of work. Limbo can be usable in high level content, though he can still struggle against specific enemy types that pretty much just nullify all of his abilities. You can probably take a guess as to one of the types based on that wording. But anyway, he also isn't a very team friendly frame, which I also think could be touched up on a little bit. Second, it seems everyone disagrees with how you're supposed to play Limbo. So do expect this video to contradict with what someone else might say about him or how you personally play him. And lastly, I'm covering what your stats change on the abilities as well, mainly because I didn't do that in my Frost video, but also to stretch the runtime of this one a little bit more. And with that said, let's get into this video. Before we can get started on Limbo's abilities, we need to cover the elephant in the room. Limbo's entire gimmick is the Rift, a sort of second dimension. Things within the Rift can be seen, but cannot be interacted with outside of the Rift. The big exception to this rule is abilities, as both Warframes and Eximus units will ignore the boundaries of the Rift. Additionally, while in the Rift, Warframes gain 1 energy per second, and 10 energy while eliminating an enemy within the Rift. Also to note, the Rift keeps you from tripping hazards and spy missions like the Corpus lasers or the Grenier energy walls. You do still set off cameras, though. You are intangible, not invisible. Also, a quick PSA for everyone who gets infuriated playing with Limbos. You can roll out of the rift with your dodge roll. Something people seem to forget when they decide to stand in front of me whenever I'm using Banish. Limbo's passive is that on dodge, he enters the rift. Simple enough, right? Though what complicates his passive is this. What I can only describe as a tear in space-time. This is a portal that Limbo leaves during his dodge, and yes, this is more than just a visual effect. Anything that touches it will pass into the rift. So if teammates walk into one, they will be put into the rift. And then they'll blame you like they didn't see the bright blue portal. I tried to show this, but it doesn't show that they're in the rift very well for the limbo. My friend did say he was in the rift because the filter changed. Also to note, you can only enter the rift using the portals. You cannot exit. Each portal lasts around 10 seconds and has a banish duration of around 15 seconds. You could use this to banish an enemy, but you'll only get one or two at a time, so there isn't much of a point to it. I've also heard some people say to use it on a downed ally to let them regenerate energy as you revive, but to be honest, I'd rather just use banish since I don't pass over them and waste a bunch of time. Banish is Limbo's first active ability that you may already be well acquainted with. Tapping the button will send a group of enemies into the rift. This is actually done within a cone scan, so the further you are, the more enemies you're going to catch within it. Also to note, there is a knockdown effect tied to this ability. Any enemy that is pushed into the rift through Banish will be knocked down, and this is actually very useful. For those of you who don't know, knockdown enemies can be open to melee finishers, and this can allow Limbo to pretty much one-shot very high armored enemies that normally wouldn't go down to his guns. The game is also very weird with what it considers knocked down. For example, if an enemy is getting back up, it still for some reason counts as them being knocked down. Now, if you forgot my wording on it, I said this is what happens when you tap the button. Holding the button does what I'll refer to as a rift dump. This ejects everything in your rift, with some exceptions we're going to go over later. Doing this costs no energy either. Banish also has an augment called Rift Haven. This makes it heal allies you banish over time. Now, whether or not it will make them forgive you for banishing them is up in the air. At max rank, this makes them heal about 25% of their health over time, and this does scale with ability strength. As for how mods affect the ability, duration will affect how long things are banished for. Range is going to affect how far it can reach, as well as the cone's max radius. And lastly, strength will affect the impact damage you deal, as well as the healing over time using Rift Haven. We all know the reasons you got Limbo was to grab this ability and pretend to be Dio. Unless you're me. Honestly, I hadn't watched JoJo when I started playing. Anyways, Stasis is straightforward. When cast, all enemies within the rift stop moving, the exception being those with Overguard or boss enemies. It also freezes status timers, which is great for things like condition overload or damage over time effects. This used to allow Limbo to turn enemies into health dispensers using life strike and bleed damage. Until they took that away. Seriously, DE, why? Anyways, there isn't much to this power, but it does its job very well. You can use it after Banish to confirm finishers on enemies. You can use it to stall trash mobs while you focus down heavy units. And it acts as Limbo's survivability against any ranged units that can still move as it stops their bullets. Even if an Xmas unit is moving within his rift, the bullets will stop mid-air. Stat wise, all that changes is duration. I really hope they give this an augment someday. Something like frozen bullets are rewound when you cancel the ability. Rift Surge is what I can best describe as a Rift virus. On cast, enemies in the Rift will be infected. This alone does nothing. However, when they leave the Rift, they will perform a radial banish, pulling themselves and enemies in range back into the Rift. This means if a nullifier shows up, then you still keep enemies in the Rift. It also artificially extends Cataclysm's range, as enemies will be leaving a stasis Cataclysm as it shrinks. If they are killed, the surge is sent to a nearby enemy out of the rift. I want to make a complaint here, though. DE, what is the point of having surge on an enemy outside of the rift? The point of rift surge is to pull more enemies in without leaving. So why is it that they now have a useless effect on enemies outside of the rift? It would help if this pulled them into the rift and gave them the surge effect. On the bright side, it does still count towards the augment, which we're about to cover. Rift Torrent gives Limbo a damage boost for each enemy with Rift Surge, though this buff only applies while he's in the Rift. And, I can kind of understand that. Because with Rift Torrent, he can get up to around, oh my lord! I typically run 40% strength on Limbo, and I still get some massive numbers with him. And if you see an arbitration with added strength to Limbo, you can expect the number to get absolutely insane with just how high it can get. This augment is practically a must have part of his kit. In a game where you kill enemies, you need to have some form of damage. Limbo is borderline unplayable in high level content unless you have this on him to actually do something. Anyways, duration affects how long the surge and its banish lasts. Range affects the radius in which you inflict Rift Surge, as well as the banish and transfer range. And strength affects the buff Rift Torrent gives per enemy. Limbo's final ability, Cataclysm, creates a giant rift bubble. Regardless of what plane people were in, this puts them into the rift. Unless you haven't played Limbo much or only use him in Premier and Infested missions, you would know that the second you throw down your Cataclysm, a nullifier can and will show up to ruin your day. Though, as far as other attributes, the Cataclysm will shrink as time goes on. The shrinking is more related to its range rather than its duration, as a large Cataclysm will shrink a lot more than a small Cataclysm will. Additionally, the Cataclysm's walls will damage any enemies that touch them both entering and exiting. This actually lets it nuke in low level missions. Also, if you manually deactivate the Cataclysm, it causes an explosion with some really weird scaling. It does more damage at its smallest size, and it does less damage to enemies that have already been hit by the blast. The blast isn't that notable in higher levels, and no, it does not benefit from Rift Torrent. Comparing my 40% strength to 240% strength, I didn't get any massive damage increase. Cataclysm also has an augment you're able to take, only if you feel like wasting mod space. At max rank, Cataclysmic Continuum gives you a whopping 1 second of extra duration per kill. Now, you can give me an argument that, oh, if you just play in a team or use AoE weapons, then you can get several seconds. The thing is, Limbo has no problem getting energy. You can just use Rift Surge and cast another one no problem. You're better off using that mod space for extra duration or another augment. This is just a personal opinion, so if it works for you, then good. If you do use this, do note you get duration back, not range. So it won't grow after you get killed. It also seems to cap at its starting duration, so don't think you can generate a ton of duration to the point you can skip out on it. But hey, you can make it work, then hats off to you. Duration mods will extend Cataclysm's duration. And before you ask, no, it does not help its augment. That stays at a static 1 second boost. Range increases its radius, and strength buffs the damage of the blast. Oddly, the walls don't seem to scale at all, as I did the same 10 damage to heavy gunners both with a 40% and a 240% build. Now that we have a good handle on what he does, let's go over how you put this into practice. Weapon wise, I mostly just went with what fits his style, so the Ferox, the Grimoire, and the Destreza. You could say they suit him. The main thing you want to look out for is burst damage and AoE damage. Status and crit don't really matter, but I run a crit Ferox and Destreza with a status Grimoire. I focus on using the Destreza and Ferox for my main damage, with the Grimoire as more of a support tool for status condition and universal orb. Because of Limbo's stasis, he benefits from mods like Galvanized Crosshairs and Galvanized Scope. Unless you miss headshots on a stationary target, these help you build up that damage fast. He also benefits from mods that help his survivability, so mods like Life Strike and Healing Return on melee weapons. For companions, go with robotics that can do status conditions. This helps Limbo with doing damage, and with shield boosting mods, it can also help him with his survivability. As for how to build him, I can't say for sure. People tend to vary with Limbo, so everyone disagrees with how you should play him. But here's how I went about it. My main focuses are range and duration. Limbo at his core is CC, so you can actually forget about strength unless you're running his Rift Haven. Honestly, you can even forget about strength with his Rift Torrent, as if you have enough range, you'll still see some massive damage numbers. Though in Corpus, you'll want to run a minimum range build as to avoid nullifiers popping your bubble. For survivability, I invested a lot of my build towards it. Adaptation and redirection have been my biggest help towards it, as the large shield pool helps build resistances without it hitting my health too fast. Quick thinking acts as a failsafe since I have a ton of energy generation anyways. For arcanes, I run Energize and Bolt Augmented. Energize helps keep my energy topped off, and Augmented helps me snowball with Rift Torrent. For helmet abilities, you have a few options. Really, he can work with a ton of abilities to bolster his kit, but the one I recommend above all others is Silence. By using Silence and Stasis, Limbo makes it so that XMS enemies can no longer harm him in the Rift. This also helps against Steel Path Acolytes, though will still struggle against some of them. Now for the actual gameplay. Upon approaching a group, you either want to use Banish or Cataclysm based on the size. Try to use Banish over Cataclysm, as it costs less and can knock enemies down for melee finishers. After sending them into the Rift, you want to follow up with Stasis and Rift Surge if you have the Torrent augment. If there's any Eximus units in the group, prioritize them first, at least until you get through their overguard. Once they're in Stasis as well, you can then prioritize things like bosses, acolytes, or the Stalker. The reason being is that while they cannot be frozen at all, Eximus units pose a larger threat with their wide scale abilities. After you deal with enemies that Stasis can't stop, then begin picking off the others. Focus on Eximus units again, as once your Stasis wears off, they will become the biggest threat once more. Make sure to use those melee finishers, as more often than not, they will one-shot the enemy. Defense objectives are a bit different, but still easy. In mobile defense and excavation, you run a small cataclysm and just wait out the timer with no problems. In actual defense, though, you can do the same, though you need to get kills to progress. If you are going max range in defense, do not use stasis. The reason being is that the game can only progress if you get kills, which you can't do if enemies don't come to you. Granted, this is fine if you play solo, in which case this won't bother anyone, but your team will not appreciate a long mission. The same goes for survival. On notes with teams, be mindful with your use of Banish and Rift Surge. The Rift's visual effect is hard to see, especially in the middle of a firefight. These two can cause your small groups to get out of hand very fast. Also, be aware of when you should dump the Rift so that your team can deal with them. Being a pain on a team will be a very fast way to be sent to the pit of post migration, only to come back to a group of enemies you aren't able to handle. For that reason, though, Cataclysm is also actually very good to use in teams, as unlike Banish and Rift Surge, it is very easy for your team to know who is in the Rift because it's whoever is within the giant bubble. Limbo is a frame that is demanding of the player to be precise in their playstyle. Every encounter needs to be dealt with using a pre designated strategy. He isn't like other frames that can just wipe out a room with a single button. But above all else, don't give up on playing him because you didn't get him on the first try. Because once you learn how to use Limbo, you'll be able to deal with enemies at the drop of a hat. Thanks to everyone who made it to the end, all 9 of you who actually watch our videos. This video would have been made sooner, but I had a lot on my plate lately and I was not feeling like working on this in my spare time. But if you did enjoy this, maybe like the video. Check out our other content. We have a few projects in the works right now, but if you're just here for the Warframe stuff, then maybe comment what frame you want to see me make a video for. Currently, I have one in mind, but if you guys want a different frame, I may do that first. And I think that's about it for this video. Goodbye.